I died on a Tuesday, not dramatically either. No car crash, no villain monologue, no slow-motion last breath with someone holding my hand. I fell asleep reading chapter 47 of The Alpha's Reckoning, an Omegaverse web novel I had been absolutely, embarrassingly obsessed with, and I just did not wake up. Or rather, I woke up, just not as myself. The first thing I registered was the smell. Not the usual staleness of my apartment in New Haven, not the faint ghost of takeout I had forgotten to throw away. This was something else. Pine and cold morning air, and the sharp, clean bite of an October that had teeth. The second thing I registered was that I was lying on a floor that was definitely not my hardwood. Marble. Cold, white marble. I sat up slowly. My hands, longer fingers than I remembered, sharper knuckles, a thin silver ring on my right index finger, pressed against the floor, and the moment my skin made contact with that ring, something detonated behind my eyes. A flash, a memory that was not mine. A man standing in a courtyard, pressing that ring into another man's chest and saying very quietly, "You will regret the day you chose him over me." I yanked my hand back so fast I nearly smacked myself in the face. "Okay," I said out loud. My voice came out lower than I expected, smoother, like someone had taken my regular voice and run it through an audio filter that made everything sound vaguely dangerous. "Okay, we are not doing that right now." I stood up. I was in a bedroom. Not a bedroom, actually. A chamber. The kind of room that existed in novels written by people who used words like opulent without irony. High ceilings, heavy drapes in deep charcoal gray, a bed that could comfortably sleep 6 people, and a small emotional crisis. And a mirror across the room that reflected back a face I recognized immediately. Because I had read about this face for 47 chapters. Sharp jaw, dark eyes with just enough coldness in them to make people uncomfortable. A mouth that the author had described, no fewer than 3 times, as made for cruelty. High cheekbones, the kind of effortless, dangerous beauty that existed in fiction specifically to make the hero's life complicated. I was looking at Cael Mercer, the villain. "Oh no," I whispered at my own reflection. "Oh, absolutely not." Cael Mercer was the villain of The Alpha's Reckoning. I knew his entire arc by heart. He was the disgraced Omega from a fallen pack family who had spent 2 years manipulating everyone around the story's hero, Everett Kane, out of bitterness and obsession. He sabotaged relationships. He spread false information through the pack. He poisoned a rival's suppressants, which, for the record, I always thought the author had handled badly because the narrative never gave him a real motive beyond jealousy, which was lazy writing, but that was beside the point. The point was that Cael Mercer died in chapter 52. Everett Kane exposed him in front of the entire Eastern Pack Council, stripped him of his protection status, and had him exiled into the outer territories where, it was strongly implied, he did not survive the winter. I was in chapter 48. I had 4 chapters to not get killed. "Phenomenal," I said to the mirror. "This is genuinely phenomenal." I needed information. I needed to understand where I was in the timeline, what Cael had already done, and how deep the damage was. I needed to not touch anything in this room without preparation, because apparently my hands were now loaded weapons that fired other people's memories at my face without warning. That was new. That was something Cael Mercer absolutely did not have in the novel, which meant something in the transmigration had gone sideways, or the universe had a sense of humor, or both. I had just decided to sit back down on the marble floor and breathe for a moment, a perfectly reasonable response to waking up as a fictional villain 4 chapters before his death, when the door opened. I turned. Standing in the doorway was a child, 4 years old, maybe just barely 5, with dark, curly hair and enormous brown eyes, and a stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm that had clearly been loved down to its last thread. He was wearing a blue sweater 2 sizes too big for him, and he was staring at me with an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy. He took 3 running steps across the marble floor and crashed directly into my legs. "Mama," he said into my knee, very matter-of-factly, like this was a normal Tuesday. Which for him, apparently it was. Every single thought in my head stopped. I looked down at this child who smelled faintly of cedar and something warm and sweet that my newly inherited omega senses apparently recognized before my brain did, because something deep in my chest pulled toward him like a tide responding to the moon without being asked. I looked back at the doorway, standing there having followed the boy in, and now staring at me with an expression that sat somewhere between cold fury and something I could not name, was a man I also recognized immediately. Tall, dark-haired, a jaw like it had been designed specifically to make omega biology forget its manners. Eyes the color of deep water in winter, gray-green and absolutely unreadable. Everett Cain, the hero, the man whose novel I had been reading when I died. He looked at me holding his son, and his expression did not soften even slightly. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet in the way that very dangerous things were quiet. "I see you are awake, Cael." Noah pulled back just far enough to beam up at me. "I told Daddy you were not dead," he informed me, with the serene confidence of someone who had been correct and wanted credit for it. I opened my mouth, closed it, looked at Everett Cain, who was clearly 2 seconds from making a decision about me that I was not going to enjoy. Looked back down at Noah, who was still smiling at me like I was the most important person in the room. "Yeah, buddy," I heard myself say, my voice coming out steadier than I had any right to expect. "I am definitely not dead. Not yet, anyway." Everett Cain did not smile at that. He did not look relieved or warm or anything even adjacent to human softness. He just stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and his jaw set and his eyes moving over me like he was running a quiet calculation, adding up numbers that I was not going to like the total of. Noah, meanwhile, had zero interest in the tension between the 2 adults in the room. He grabbed 2 of my fingers with his whole fist and tugged. "I brought Biscuit," he announced, holding up the destroyed rabbit for my inspection. "He missed you too." I looked at Biscuit. Biscuit looked back at me with one button eye and the kind of blank acceptance that only came from years of unconditional love and being dragged everywhere by a 4-year-old. "Good," I said carefully. "Biscuit looks very concerned about my health." Noah nodded, completely serious. "He cried." "I believe it." "Enough." Everett's voice cut across the room without raising. He did not shout. He did not need to. It was the kind of voice that a room simply obeyed, the way weather obeyed pressure systems, because the alternative was destruction. He looked at Noah, and his entire face changed in a way that was honestly a little startling, like watching a winter storm briefly remember it used to be summer. "Go find Mrs. Calloway, Noah. Tell her you want breakfast." Noah considered this negotiation for a moment. He looked up at me. "Will Mama eat too?" Every hair on my body stood up. Not from fear, from something else entirely, something warm and immediate that my borrowed biology was producing without asking my permission first. I had no idea what Cael's history with this child was. The novel had never mentioned a child. There was no child in the Alpha's reckoning. Noah Cain did not exist in any chapter I had ever read, which meant I was already off script, which meant I had no idea what was coming. "Go," Everett said again, softer this time, and Noah released my fingers, kissed my knee with a loud, smacking sound that was objectively adorable, and trotted out of the room, dragging Biscuit behind him. The door clicked shut. The room became a completely different kind of space. Everett moved away from the doorway and walked toward the window, putting deliberate distance between himself and me in a way that felt like strategy rather than comfort. The morning light hit him sideways, and I noted, with the detached irritation of someone who had not asked to be attracted to anyone today, that he was unfairly put together for 7 in the morning. Dark gray shirt, dark trousers, the kind of effortless composure that came from growing up with money and pack authority and never once in his life having to panic about which body he woke up in. Must be nice. You should not be conscious, he said to the window. The pack physician said the suppressant withdrawal would keep you down for another 2 days at minimum. I filed that away. Cael had been on suppressants, heavy ones apparently, the kind that caused withdrawal serious enough to incapacitate. That explained the cold floor and the general sense that this body had recently been through something unpleasant. Surprise, I said. He turned to look at me then, and I watched something move behind his eyes that he immediately locked back behind glass. Are you in pain? The question surprised me. Not the words, but the texture of them. The very slight roughness underneath the control, like sandpaper hidden beneath silk. It did not sound like a question Everett Cain asked people he despised. It sounded like a question a man asked when he was angry at himself for still caring about the answer. I am fine, I said. You collapsed 3 days ago in the East Courtyard, in front of half the pack. I am fine now. He studied me for a moment. You are different. I went very still. On the inside. On the outside, I kept my expression at exactly the level of mild, slightly bored composure that felt right for someone wearing Cael Mercer's face. Different how? Your eyes. He said it simply, like a fact. Cael does not look at people like that. Like what? Like he is cataloging them for a research project. I almost laughed. I genuinely almost laughed, and I pressed my back teeth together to stop it, because laughing at Everett Cain 4 chapters before my scheduled death seemed statistically unwise. Maybe I hit my head. He did not look convinced. He looked like a man who had spent years learning to read a specific person and had just discovered that the book had been rewritten overnight in a language he almost understood, but not quite. It was a deeply uncomfortable look to be on the receiving end of. Then he took 1 step toward me, and my omega senses did something I was completely unprepared for. His scent hit me. Not the way scent worked in my old life, where you smelled a cologne and thought, okay, pleasant, moving on. This was biological and immediate and embarrassingly total, the way a sound could fill an entire room before you even registered you were hearing it. Cedar and cold rain, and something underneath both of those things that was warmer, darker, like the inside of a house with all the lights on in winter, seen from outside in the snow. My pulse did something extremely unprofessional. I took a slow breath through my mouth instead of my nose, which helped approximately nothing, and focused very hard on the middle distance. Everett stopped walking. He was maybe 4 feet from me. He tilted his head slightly, and I watched his nostrils flare, barely, just once, in the involuntary way that alphas did when their own biology was registering something unexpected. Your scent changed, he said, very quiet, very careful. Withdrawal, I said, probably. Probably, he repeated, like the word tasted uncertain in his mouth. Neither of us moved. The morning light stretched between us across the marble floor, and Noah's voice floated up distantly from somewhere below, cheerfully demanding something from Mrs. Calloway. And I stood in Cael Mercer's body, in Cael Mercer's bedroom 4 chapters from Cael Mercer's death, breathing shallowly while the hero of someone else's story looked at me like I was a puzzle he had already decided he did not want to solve. His eyes dropped, just briefly, to the ring on my right hand, and I remembered, with the clarity of cold water, what happened the last time I touched it. You will regret the day you chose him over me. Who had Cael said that to? More importantly, was that person in this house? I needed to find out. Carefully, without touching anything else in this room with my bare hands, without letting Everett Cain stare at me long enough to confirm whatever suspicion was currently building behind those winter-colored eyes, and without doing anything that Cael Mercer would not plausibly do. The problem was, I had no idea what Cael Mercer would plausibly do. The novel had written him from the outside. Every scene featuring Cael was filtered through Everett's perspective, which meant I had 47 chapters of how Cael looked and spoke and moved, and approximately 0 chapters of why. He was constructed entirely from consequence. The author had never once climbed inside his head. Lucky me, I got to do it first. "You are staring at the ring," I said. Everett's eyes lifted to mine. "You never wore it before. Things change. That ring belonged to your father." I kept my face neutral with the focused effort of someone diffusing something. "I know whose ring it is." I absolutely did not know whose ring it was. I knew it had a memory attached to it so sharp, it had nearly taken my eye out. I knew the voice in that memory had been cold and deliberate and aimed at someone specific. What I did not know was who that someone was, and whether they were currently within this pact territory, and whether they wanted me dead already, or were planning to want me dead later. Everett watched me for another moment, then turned toward the door with a kind of clean decisiveness that said the conversation was over because he had decided it was over, not because it was actually finished. "Breakfast is at 7:30, he said. "Pack members eat together on Monday mornings. That has not changed." "And I am still considered a pack member?" He paused at the door. He did not turn around. The line of his shoulders was very straight and very still, in the way that bodies went still when they were working hard to stay that way. "For now," he said. Then he left. I stood in the middle of the marble floor and listened to his footsteps move down the hall, and thought several things in rapid succession, the most pressing of which was, Cael Mercer had been living inside Everett Kane's pack house, as in inside the building, as in sharing meals and hallways and presumably at least some portion of daily life with the man who was, in 4 chapters, going to destroy him in front of everyone. The novel had not mentioned this either. The novel, I was beginning to understand, had left out a considerable amount of information. I looked around the room again with fresh attention, not at the architecture this time, but at the details, the things that told you who someone was when they were not performing for an audience. There was a book on the nightstand, face down to mark the page, and something about the care with which it had been placed there, like someone who did not want to lose their place, but also did not want to bend the spine, struck me as quietly at odds with the Cael I knew from the text. There was a small frame photograph on the dresser that I moved toward carefully, keeping my hands inside my sleeves. The photo showed 2 boys, young, maybe 12 and 9. One of them was obviously a younger Cael, those sharp features already forming, but his expression in the photograph was something I had never seen described in 47 chapters of the novel. He was laughing, genuinely, unguardedly laughing, leaning into the other boy, who had darker skin and an enormous grin and a familiar pair of eyes. I leaned closer. Those eyes. I knew those eyes. I had seen them on a 4-year-old child an hour ago. The second boy in the photograph was a young Everett Kane. I straightened up slowly and stared at the wall and revised my entire understanding of the story I had thought I knew. They had been children together, close enough to take photographs together, close enough that the younger Cael's body language was completely open in a way it never was in any adult scene I had read. Whatever they had been to each other before the novel started, it was not simple. It was not the clean villain-hero binary the narrative had presented. There was history here, layered and specific, and probably painful, and I was standing in the middle of it with no map. "Okay," I said to the photograph. "Okay, I need a plan." The plan, as far as I could construct one in the next 2 minutes before a Monday pack breakfast that I apparently could not skip, was this. Do not die in chapter 52. Do not let Cael's original schemes play out. Do not touch anything without sleeves. Figure out what the ring memory meant. Figure out who Noah's mother was, because Noah existed and the novel did not know that, which meant something had happened that the author had either not written or had deliberately erased. And most urgently, Do not do anything that made Everett look at me with that particular expression again, the one that sat between suspicion and something older and more complicated that I did not have the vocabulary for yet. Simple, completely manageable, absolutely fine. I pulled on the closest jacket hanging near the door, checked that the sleeves covered my hands adequately, and went to find the dining room. The house was enormous. Of course it was. Everett Cael was the head of the Eastern Connecticut Pack, which in the world of this novel translated to something between old money and small government, a family that had held territory for 4 generations and built infrastructure around it. Schools and clinics and pack housing spreading out from the main estate like a held breath. The hallways were wide and the ceilings were high, and everything smelled faintly of cedar and clean linen and that undercurrent of pack scent that I was still getting used to. The warm, layered, collective note of people who lived together long enough that their biology started harmonizing. It was, honestly, a little overwhelming. I followed the sound of Noah's voice. That turned out to be reliable navigation, because Noah was apparently incapable of being in a room quietly. He was sitting at a long dining table next to a woman in her 60s with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the posture of someone who had raised difficult people professionally and was not intimidated by any of them. Mrs. Calloway, presumably. She was cutting Noah's toast into triangles with the focused precision of someone who had done this approximately 10,000 times. Noah saw me in the doorway, and his entire face lit up like a power surge. "Mama, I saved you the seat next to me." He patted the chair beside him with both hands. "I told Mrs. Calloway you like orange juice better than apple juice, but she said she was not sure, so she put both." Mrs. Calloway looked up at me over her glasses with an expression that was carefully, professionally, unreadable. "Mr. Mercer, you are looking better than expected." "High bar," I said pleasantly, and came to sit beside Noah. The dining room had 6 other people in it. I cataloged them without making it obvious I was cataloging them. The way you learn to observe a room when you were the kind of person who read too many novels and paid attention to background characters. 3 men around Everett's age, all carrying the particular physical stillness of alphas with authority, all of them watching me with varying degrees of wariness. 2 younger pack members, betas by scent, who were having a quiet argument at the far end of the table about something involving a car. And Everett himself, at the head of the table, already seated, already drinking coffee, already watching me with that measuring quality that I was starting to recognize as his default setting for anything he did not fully understand. I picked up the orange juice. Noah grabbed my sleeve to show me something Biscuit was doing, which appeared to be sitting in Noah's lap and existing, and I leaned down to examine Biscuit's activity with appropriate seriousness while using the angle to scan the room more carefully. 3 alphas I did not recognize from the novel. That was notable. The novel had named Everett's inner circle, and none of these faces matched those names, which either meant I was further off script than I had realized, or the novel had simplified the pack structure for narrative convenience. Then the door on the far side of the dining room opened, and someone walked in who made every quietly managed thought in my head go sideways. He was tall, blonde in the particular way that looked expensive rather than natural, the kind of face that smiled easily and meant none of it, with light eyes that moved across a room like they were calculating the exits. He was carrying 2 coffee cups, and he set one in front of Everett with the casual ease of someone who had done it before. Someone who understood the geography of Everett's space well enough to move through it without asking permission. He looked across the table at me, and his smile widened by exactly 3 degrees. "Cael," he said warmly, "you are up. We were all so worried." The scent coming off him was pleasant on the surface. Citrus and clean cotton, the kind of scent that worked very hard to seem harmless. My psychometry was not a smell-based power, but something in Cael's body, something older and more animal than thought, responded to this man with a reaction that was not warmth and not comfort. It was the very quiet, very specific alertness of a person who had been hurt by something that looked like this before. I smiled back at him with exactly as much warmth as he had offered me. "Thank you," I said. "It is good to be back." I did not know his name yet. I did not know his role, but I knew, with the certainty of someone who had read enough stories to recognize a particular kind of character, that this man was not what he was presenting himself as. And he knew that I was looking at him, and neither of us said anything else. Across the table, Everett watched the exchange with an expression I could not read, and Noah put a piece of toast triangle in my hand without being asked. And somewhere in the warm noise of a Monday morning packed breakfast, the first quiet move in a game I had not agreed to play had already been made. His name, I found out 11 minutes later, was Stellan Price. Noah told me because Noah had apparently appointed himself my personal orientation guide to a life I had woken up inside without a syllabus. He leaned close to my ear while reaching across me for his second triangle of toast and whispered, with great ceremony, "That is Uncle Stell. He smells like lemons. I do not like lemons." I looked down at him. He looked back up at me with the serene conviction of a child who had made a completely reasonable assessment and was comfortable standing behind it. "Good instincts," I said quietly. Noah nodded, satisfied, and went back to his toast. Stellan Price. The name did not appear anywhere in the 47 chapters I had read. Not once, not as a background mention, not as a footnote, which was either a continuity gap the author had never intended to fill, or it was something more deliberate, the kind of absence that only made sense once you understood what was being hidden and why. I watched him from behind my orange juice. He sat 2 seats down from Everett, close enough to be considered inner circle, far enough to perform modesty about it. He spoke when addressed and not much otherwise, which was the specific social discipline of someone who understood that silence was more powerful than speech when you were trying to appear harmless. He laughed at something one of the other alphas said, the kind of laugh that arrived exactly on time, not too loud, not too brief, calibrated to land rather than to be genuine. Every one of my borrowed instincts was sitting up straight. Everett was not watching Stellan the way you watched a threat. He was watching him the way you watched furniture. Comfortable, familiar, present without demanding attention. Which told me that whatever Stellan Price was doing inside this pack house, he had been doing it long enough that Everett had stopped noticing. That was either a testament to very good trust or very good acting. Based on the citrus scent in the perfectly timed laugh, I had a strong working theory. Breakfast ended without incident, which I chose to count as a personal victory. The pack members filed out with the easy rhythm of people who shared a routine, brief exchanges, and the scrape of chairs, and Noah's running commentary on the structural integrity of Biscuit's left ear, which had apparently been repaired 3 times and was showing signs of needing a 4th intervention. I stood up. Stellan was suddenly beside me. Not aggressively. He did not crowd my space or move into my scent radius in the deliberate way that alphas sometimes did when they were making a point. He simply materialized at my elbow with his empty coffee cup and his pleasant face and said, "Can I walk with you? I want to check in. You gave us quite a scare." The word "us" landed with a specific weight. "Sure," I said. We walked out into the main corridor together, and I kept my sleeved hands loose at my sides, and my stride easy, and my expression at the particular level of careful warmth that said, "I am listening," without saying, "I believe you." "How are you actually feeling?" he asked. He had a good voice, the kind of voice that made people feel like the question was personal, like he was asking something the room was not privy to. "Better than expected." The physician was very concerned. 3 days is a long time. He glanced at me sideways, especially given what happened before you collapsed. I let a beat pass. Exactly 1 beat, not 2, because 2 would have telegraphed that I was constructing an answer rather than recalling a memory. "I am managing." Stellan smiled. It was a genuinely good smile. I hated it. You know you can talk to me, Cael. After everything, I think we are past formality. After everything. 2 words doing an enormous amount of work in a single sentence. They implied history and intimacy and shared experience without specifying any of it, which meant they could mean almost anything depending on what I confirmed or denied in response. I had read enough novels to know a fishing line when one was dropped in front of me. Of course, I said pleasantly. He seemed to relax slightly, marginally, the way a person relaxed when they got the answer that confirmed the assumption they had already made. He thought I was still Cael. He thought he understood what I remembered and what I wanted and what pressure points to press. Good. Let him. Everett is going to push you on the territory documentation this week, Stellan said, shifting his tone to something more practical, more confiding. The Eastern boundary situation. He mentioned it at the end of last week's council session. I thought you should know ahead of time. Territory documentation. Eastern boundary. I filed both phrases carefully and said, I appreciate that. I just want to make sure you are prepared. You know how he gets when PAC business is involved. Another sideways glance. He does not make room for personal history during official matters. I stopped walking. Not dramatically, just a natural pause, the kind that happened when you reached a junction in a hallway and needed to decide which direction to go. I turned to look at Stellan directly and kept my voice easy and my eyes steady. Thank you for the warning, I said. Something moved through his expression. Quick, small, controlled. The flash of a man who had expected a different reaction and adjusted smoothly to the one he received. Then the pleasant smile was back, and he nodded, and he peeled off down the left corridor with a casual wave that managed to seem both friendly and deliberate at the same time. I stood at the junction and watched him go. Then I turned right and went looking for a room with a door that locked. I found a small library on the 2nd floor, which in any other situation would have been the best discovery of my week. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, 2 leather armchairs, a window overlooking the back gardens where the October grass was the particular shade of dark gold that happened right before autumn committed fully to its intentions. I shut the door, confirmed the lock, sat down in the armchair closest to the window, and allowed myself 60 seconds of what I privately labeled structured panic. This was fine, completely fine. I was 4 chapters from death, inside the body of a villain whose history I did not fully know, with a psychometric power that fired without warning, and a child who called me mama, and an alpha who looked at me like I was a language he used to speak fluently and had since forgotten. And there was a blonde man in this house who smiled like a service industry professional and moved like someone who knew exactly how much he was trusted and had done the math on how to use it. Fine, totally fine. I pulled my knees up, pressed my sleeved forearms against them, and thought, what did I actually know? 1. Cael Mercer had lived inside Everett Kane's pack house, which the novel had never described. That proximity implied a relationship more complicated than enemy or rival. The childhood photograph confirmed they had known each other for decades. 2. Noah Kane existed, was approximately 4 years old, and called Cael Mama with the ease of a child who had been doing it long enough for it to feel like the most natural thing in the world. The novel had never mentioned Noah, which meant Noah's existence had either been written out or had happened in a timeline the original author had not followed. Either way, Noah was real, and Noah was here, and Noah had Everett's eyes, and the warmth of someone who had been loved carefully since birth. And none of that was background information. All of that was the center of everything. 3. Cael's ring carried a memory of someone being threatened. Cael's body had an involuntary alarm response to Stellan Price, and Stellan Price had information about PAC council sessions that he was choosing to share selectively with Cael, which was not the behavior of someone acting in Cael's interest. That was the behavior of someone managing Cael, keeping him oriented in a particular direction, feeding information at a specific angle. I pressed the back of my head against the armchair and stared at the ceiling. The fourth thing I knew was the one I was still working around the edges of, not quite looking at directly, the way you did not look directly at something that might look back. Everett Kane had stood in a doorway this morning and asked if I was in pain, and his voice had gone rough on the question in a way that did not match someone who simply wanted their pack villain conscious for administrative purposes. And when his scent had crossed the distance between us, my biology had done something I was completely unequipped to categorize, something that sat below thought and above feeling and was entirely too significant for a Tuesday. I was the villain. He was the hero. Those were the fixed points. Everything else was rewriting itself in real time, and I could not afford to lose track of the original geometry just because the details were more complicated than the novel had suggested. The library door handle moved. I sat up straight. The door opened, and Noah came in, biscuit under one arm, with the completely unself-conscious confidence of a child who had never encountered a locked door that was locked against him personally. "I knew you would be in here," he said with deep satisfaction. He crossed the room and climbed into my lap without asking, arranging himself with the compact efficiency of someone who had done this before and had opinions about the best configuration. "You always come here when you are thinking very hard." I looked down at the top of his curly head. Something in my chest performed an action I did not have a word for. It was not the biological pull from earlier, the tide and moon thing that Omega instincts produced. This was something quieter, something that sat very still and paid attention. "How do you know I was thinking very hard?" I asked. "Because your face does the thing," Noah said simply, opening Biscuit's ear to examine the repair work with the focused concern of a junior surgeon. "What thing?" He looked up at me. "The thing where you look like everything is very loud inside your head, but you are being very quiet on the outside." He patted my arm once, the way small children offered comfort, completely direct and completely sincere. "It is okay. I do that too sometimes." I looked at this child who should not exist in the story I thought I knew, who had apparently spent enough time with Cael Mercer to learn his expressions, who called him Mama without ceremony or question. And I understood with a clarity that felt like cold water that whatever I had walked into was not a villain story at all. It was a love story that had gone wrong somewhere in a chapter that no one had written yet. From somewhere below us, Everett's voice moved through the house, low and even, speaking to someone I could not see. Noah heard it too. His small body settled more firmly against my chest with a trust so total it was almost unbearable. And I thought, very quietly, in the part of myself that was still Jordan from New Haven, who had died reading chapter 47 on a Tuesday night, I am not going to let chapter 52 happen. Not to this child, not to whatever this actually is, not on my watch. The problem with making quiet, dramatic internal declarations was that reality did not pause to acknowledge them. It just kept moving, indifferent and specific. And right now reality was a 4-year-old shifting in my lap to show me the critical structural damage to Biscuit's left ear, with the gravity of someone presenting evidence at a hearing. "See how it is pulling?" Noah traced the loose seam with one careful finger. "Mrs. Calloway says she can fix it, but she uses the wrong color thread. Last time she used brown. Biscuit's ear is supposed to be gray." "That is a legitimate concern," I said. "I told Daddy, but he said thread color does not matter for rabbits." Noah looked up at me with an expression that communicated very clearly what he thought about that particular opinion. "Your father," I said carefully, "is wrong." Noah's face broke into a grin so sudden and complete it was almost physically bright. He pressed his face against my shoulder to hide it, the way children hid smiles they were not sure they were supposed to have. I felt the warmth of it through the jacket and sat very still and did not examine the feeling that produced in my chest because I had enough to deal with today. From below, Everett's voice stopped. The house went a specific kind of quiet that had texture to it, the quiet of a large space where one sound had been providing structure, and its absence was immediately noticeable. Noah felt it too. His small body went attentive in the unconscious way that children attuned to their parents' moods did. Not frightened, just listening. Then footsteps in the hallway, measured, even, unhurried. They stopped outside the library door. A knock. 2 beats. Not requesting entry, exactly. More like announcing intention. "Come in," I said, because saying nothing would have been more suspicious than anything else. Everett opened the door. He looked at the two of us in the armchair together, Noah settled against my chest with Biscuit, me with my sleeved arms and my carefully assembled expression, and something crossed his face so quickly I almost missed it. It was gone before I could name it, but the aftermath stayed, something quieter and more complicated than the measuring look he had been wearing all morning. "Noah," his voice was even, "Mrs. Calloway is looking for you. She has the gray thread." Noah's head came up instantly. He looked at Biscuit. He looked at the door. He looked at me. "Go," I said. "I will be here." He slid out of my lap, grabbed Biscuit, and ran for the door with the focused urgency of someone executing a rescue mission. He squeezed past Everett's legs without slowing, his voice already carrying down the hallway. "Mrs. Calloway, use the gray one. Mama says gray." The hallway swallowed him. Everett and I were alone in the library. He did not come in immediately. He stood in the doorway the way he had stood in the bedroom doorway that morning, like he was making a decision about something that the doorframe represented. And I waited with my hands in my lap, and my spine straight, and my heart doing something deeply unhelpful against my ribs. "You told him thread color matters for rabbits," Everett said. "It does matter. You never cared about things like that before." That landed between us like something placed deliberately on a table. Not thrown, placed, with intent. I held his gaze and said nothing. He came into the library then, moving to the window I had been looking out of earlier, and stood with his back partially to me, looking out at the gold October grass. The morning light was shifting as clouds moved across it, making the garden go bright and dim in slow alternation. In the shifting light, with his shoulders carrying their usual composed weight, he looked like someone who had been standing in difficult positions for so long that difficult had become his resting posture. "The Eastern Boundary Documentation," he said. "Stellan told you." Not a question. "He mentioned it," I said. "Of course he did." His voice had no particular inflection on that. No anger, no approval. Just the flat recognition of a man who had already known something and was simply watching it confirmed. He turned from the window to look at me. "I need to know where your head is before we sit across from each other at a formal session. The last time we did that, you told the room that my father's land grants were fraudulent." I absorbed this information without visibly reacting, which required genuine effort because that was significant. Cael had challenged Everett's family land grants in front of a formal PAC session. That was not petty villain scheming, that was surgical. That was someone who knew exactly which structural support to knock out to start a collapse. "And were they?" I asked. Everett went very still. "Were the land grants fraudulent?" I said, keeping my voice level and genuinely curious rather than provocative. "Was Cael wrong?" The stillness lasted for 3 full seconds. Then something shifted in him, small but seismic, the way a very controlled thing shifted when it encountered a question it had not prepared for. "No," he said, "they were not fraudulent." Then it should not have mattered. It mattered because you said it in front of 17 PAC witnesses and 3 outside representatives, and the implication alone cost us 2 months of negotiation and $12,000 in documentation review. His voice had gained an edge now, still controlled, but no longer flat. "You knew exactly what you were doing." I thought about the boy in the photograph, 12 years old, laughing with an openness that no chapter of the novel had ever described. I thought about the ring and its sharp, cold memory of threatened regret. I thought about Stellan Price and his perfectly calibrated smile and his selective information delivery. "Why am I living in your house, Everett?" The edge in his voice went quiet. He looked at me for a long moment in which several things seemed to happen behind his eyes in rapid and carefully hidden succession. Then he crossed to the other armchair and sat down, which surprised me. He did not look like someone who sat down in a situation he had not already controlled. "Because of Noah," he said. "Tell me." He looked at me sharply. "You know why. Tell me anyway." Something moved through him that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but lived in the neighborhood of both. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and studied the floor between us for a moment before he looked back up. "Noah's biological father signed away his rights 14 months ago. He has not contacted Noah since. You were the one who found out, and you were the one who told me, and you were the one who stayed." He said it with the bluntness of someone reciting a list of facts they had handled carefully for so long that the only way left to say them was directly. "Whatever else has happened between us, you stayed for Noah, so you are here." I sat with that. Noah's biological father was not Cael, was not Everett, was someone else entirely, someone who had walked away 14 months ago. Noah was not Everett's biological son. The novel had presented Everett as the hero with everything, power and clarity and moral high ground, and had never once mentioned that he was raising a child alone who was not biologically his, that Cael had been the one to tell him the truth about it, that Cael had stayed. The author had written Cael as a villain, but villains did not stay for children who were not theirs. "Who was he?" I asked. "The biological father." Everett's jaw tightened, just slightly. "It does not matter now." "It matters to me." "Since when?" That was fair. Cael, as written in the novel, would not have asked that question with that tone. Cael would have used the information as leverage, not asked after it with genuine need to understand. I had been holding this body's emotional patterns like borrowed clothes and wearing them convincingly enough to pass. But I had just said something that fit me and not him, and Everett was too perceptive not to notice the seam. He was looking at me again with that particular quality of attention that made me feel like a document being read very carefully for discrepancies. "You are different," he said again, quieter this time, like he was saying it to himself as much as to me. "You mentioned that this morning. It bears repeating." The space between us felt charged in a way that was difficult to describe accurately. It was not the scent-driven biological pull from earlier, though that was still there, a low and persistent warmth in the background of everything. This was something more specific. Two people in armchairs on opposite sides of a library window, with 20 years of history I was only starting to understand, and the particular weight of all the things neither of us was saying pressing down on the afternoon, like the clouds pressing down on the October garden. "Everett," I said, and his name felt strange in my mouth, too familiar and not familiar enough at the same time, like a word in a language I had learned from books, but never spoken aloud. He looked at me. "Why did the original land grants get challenged? Not by me, before me. Why were they vulnerable to being challenged at all?" Another long pause. This one felt different from the others. The others had been him deciding what to say. This one felt like him deciding whether to say it, which was a meaningfully different hesitation. "Because my father made a private arrangement 30 years ago that was never properly documented," Everett said slowly, "with a family whose land would have bordered ours if the arrangement had gone through. It did not go through. The family lost their territory in a pact dispute, and my father never filed the boundary revision. It left a gap in the record that looked, to anyone who knew where to look, like an intentional omission." I sat forward. "Which family lost the territory?" Everett's eyes met mine. The light from the window was doing something complicated to the gray-green of them, pulling out something warmer underneath. He said the name in the same careful way he had said everything else this morning, like a man who had learned to handle certain words as if they were something that could break. "The Mercer family," he said. "Your father's land. That is what the original dispute was about, Cael. That is what it has always been about." The ring on my right hand went warm against my finger. I did not touch it. I did not need to. Because the memory I had caught that morning suddenly assembled itself into a complete sentence. And the voice in it, the cold and deliberate voice that had said, "You will regret the day you chose him over me," was not Cael's voice at all. It was Stellan Price. And the person he had said it to was Everett Kane. I sat with that knowledge for exactly 4 seconds before my brain started pulling threads. Stellan Price had threatened Everett Kane. Not openly, not in the way pack politics usually operated, with formal challenges and witness declarations. Privately, quietly, the way someone threatened a person they believed they had leverage over, which meant Stellan thought he had something on Everett, something significant enough to back that threat with real weight. And Everett was sitting across from me in this library, watching my face, with no idea that I had just assembled this from a 3-second memory and a family land history, and the specific way Stellan Price's citrus scent made Cael's borrowed body want to take one careful step backward. Everett was still waiting for me to respond to what he had said. I realized I had gone quiet for too long. "The Mercer land," I said, pulling my voice back to even. "Your father never filed the boundary revision, which means the territory technically reverted." "Technically," Everett said. The word was careful. "Under pack law, if a boundary arrangement is not documented within the original generation that negotiated it, the land defaults back to contested status. Your father tried to file a retroactive claim 6 years before he died. My father refused to acknowledge it." He paused. "I found the correspondence last year, in the estate files." I looked at him. And my father was wrong not to honor it." He said it plainly, without performance. The way someone said a hard thing that they had already made their peace with, even if the peace had cost them something. The arrangement should have been filed. The land should have been recognized as Mercer territory. It was not, and your father spent the last decade of his life fighting a claim that was legitimate and losing. The room was very quiet. Outside, the October garden shifted from bright to dim as another cloud crossed the sun. And I thought about a boy in a photograph, laughing with complete openness at age 12. And I thought about what it did to a person to grow up watching a legitimate claim get buried, to carry that specific kind of injustice through adolescence and into adulthood, to eventually arrive at a place where the only tools you had left were the sharp ones. Cael had not been a villain for the sake of it. Cael had been a person with a real grievance who had run out of legitimate options and started using the ones that remained. The novel had presented that as simple malice. It was not simple. It was not malice. It was a man who had been failed by every system he was supposed to be able to trust, including the ones sitting across from him right now, and who had made choices that were destructive and wrong and entirely human. I was furious at a dead author on behalf of a fictional character I had become, and I was aware that was an objectively strange position to be in, and I did not have time to process it. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Everett's brow came together slightly. "Because you asked." Cael would not have asked like that. "No," he agreed, "he would not have." We looked at each other. "You are doing it again," he said quietly, "the cataloging." "I am listening," I said. "There is a difference." Something shifted in his expression that I did not entirely know how to read. It was not the measuring quality from earlier. It was softer than that and more uncertain, which on Everett Kane's face was remarkable enough that I noticed it immediately. He looked, for just a moment, like someone who was standing at a door he had locked himself and was surprised to find it open. Then Noah's voice erupted from somewhere down the hall with tremendous enthusiasm. "It is gray! Mama, it is gray!" I closed my eyes briefly. Everett made a sound that was, improbably, almost a laugh. It was small, and it was gone almost instantly, but it had been real, and it changed his face entirely for the half-second it existed, stripping away the composed authority and leaving something younger and more unguarded underneath. I felt it in my sternum like a plucked string. Noah appeared in the doorway at full speed, holding Biscuit up with both hands to display the ear repair. Mrs. Calloway appeared behind him, slightly out of breath, holding a sewing kit with the expression of someone who had been on a very short but very intense journey. "Look," Noah announced, thrusting Biscuit toward me. "Perfect gray. I told her." I examined the ear with appropriate gravity. The repair was, objectively, excellent. The thread was a precise match. "That is a professional level of work, Mrs. Calloway." She looked at me over Noah's head with an expression that was almost warm. Almost. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer. I have had practice." Noah climbed back into my lap without ceremony, Biscuit secured under his arm, and leaned his back against my chest with the complete comfort of someone settling into a favorite chair. I felt Everett watching this. I did not look at him. I looked at the window and the slow, gold movement of the grass, and let the warmth of Noah's small body be something I simply allowed rather than analyzed. "I want to show you the garden," Noah said. "After. Can we go after?" "We can go after," I said. "You have to wear a coat. It is cold." "I am aware of how autumn works, buddy. Last time you said you were not cold, and then you were cold." I glanced down at him. "Last time Cael said that." Noah twisted to look up at me with a small frown. "You are Cael." There was a silence in which I did not know what to say, and Everett went very still in the periphery of my vision. "Yeah," I said after a moment. "I know." Noah studied me for another second with those enormous brown eyes that held their own specific gravity. The kind of eyes that did not accept incomplete answers, but also did not demand explanations from people they loved. Then he turned back around, apparently satisfied, and started telling Biscuit about the garden in a low and informative voice. I breathed. Everett stood. "I have PAC calls this afternoon. The boundary session is Thursday." He looked at me directly. "I would like you there." Not a command, not quite a request either. Something in between, the kind of sentence that left room for a person to decline without penalty, which from Everett Kane felt like a language he did not speak often. "I will be there," I said. He nodded once, looked at Noah briefly with that same weather turning to summer quality, and left the library. The room exhaled. Noah said, to Biscuit, "Daddy looked at Mama the way he looks at the garden when he thinks nobody is watching." I stared at the ceiling. "How does he look at the garden?" I asked, against my better judgment. Noah considered this with great seriousness. "Like it is his favorite thing, but he forgot to say so." I had no response to that. None. I sat in a library in Connecticut, inside a villain's body, with a child in my lap, delivering emotional devastation with the casual accuracy of someone who had not yet learned to aim away from the truth. And I thought about Thursday's boundary session, and Stellan's warning that had not been a warning, and the ring on my finger that I had not yet touched again. I needed to touch it again. I needed the rest of what it knew. I waited until Noah had fully committed to his one-sided conversation with Biscuit, which appeared to involve a detailed explanation of the garden's layout and which plants were interesting and which ones were boring. Then I shifted my right hand slowly, carefully, in my lap, and pressed my bare thumb against the inner band of the ring. It hit me like stepping into cold water. Not one memory this time, 3, rapid and sequential, like chapters arriving all at once. First, Stellan and Cael in a hallway, younger, Stellan's hand on Cael's arm, his voice low and precise. "You do not have to do it this way. Let me handle the documentation. The land comes back to you clean, and Everett never knows you were involved." In Cael's voice, sharp and tired. "The last time I let you handle something, Stellan, I ended up with nothing, and you ended up with a seat at his table." Second, a hospital room, quiet and white, A man in the bed with dark circles and an infant, newborn small, in his arms. And that man was not Everett and was not Cael, but had Everett's bone structure softened into something gentler, someone related. And he was crying in the exhausted, gutted way of a person who had just made a decision that would permanently define them. And Cael, sitting in the chair beside the bed, holding that man's hand. Not romantically, the way you held someone's hand when they were drowning and you were the only thing in reach. Third, Stellan again. Different hallway, different light, recent by the quality of it, his voice stripped of all its pleasant calibration. If you tell Everett what I did, I will make sure he finds out about the first petition. All of it. He will never trust you again. You will lose the child and the house and every inch of ground you have recovered. I promise you that, Cael. I promise you. I pulled my thumb off the ring. My hand was shaking. Noah felt it. He looked up at me without a word and put both his small hands over mine, covering the ring, covering the tremor, with the simple and total instinct of someone who understood that the person holding them needed to be held back. I looked down at him. He looked up at me. "It is okay," he said, with absolute 4-year-old certainty. "I am here." Something cracked open in my chest that I was not going to examine right now, because if I examined it, I was going to fall apart, and I did not have the luxury of falling apart today. I had a boundary session on Thursday. I had a blonde man in this house who had been running a very quiet, very patient operation against both Cael and Everett simultaneously, using Cael's legitimate grievance as a lever and Everett's trust as a blind spot. I had a ring full of evidence and a body full of someone else's history and a child who had just put his hands over mine like he had done it 100 times before. And I had, somewhere in the second memory, a face I had not yet placed. The man in the hospital bed. Everett's bone structure, softer. A brother, maybe. Someone who had handed a newborn to Cael with the gutted certainty of a person making a permanent choice. Noah's biological father. Not a stranger, not someone who had wandered in and out of the story, someone who was connected to Everett directly, someone whose departure 14 months ago Stellan Price might have engineered just as carefully as everything else. I pressed my free hand flat against the armchair to stop it from shaking and breathed through my nose and let Noah's cedar and warm, sweet scent anchor me to the present tense. "Hey," I said quietly. He tilted his head up. "You want to show me the garden?" His whole face opened. "Yes," he said, like I had just offered him something extraordinary. He scrambled up, grabbed my hand with both of his, and pulled me toward the door with the focused momentum of someone who had been waiting for this and was not wasting another second. I let him pull me. I held his hand. I walked with him through the wide hallways of a house that was starting to feel less like a cage and more like a place where someone had once tried very hard to build something worth protecting. And somewhere in this house, Stellan Price was sitting with his calibrated smile and his citrus scent and his perfect knowledge of everyone's pressure points. And he did not yet know that the person he thought he was managing had just changed completely. That was going to be a very interesting Thursday. The garden was exactly what the October light had promised from the library window. Wide and slightly wild at the edges, the kind of garden that had been formally designed at some point in the past and had since developed its own opinions about it. Stone paths wound between beds of ornamental grass, gone gold and rust, and a large oak at the far end had dropped enough leaves to make the ground underneath it look like something painted rather than grown. Noah knew every inch of it. He pulled me from plant to plant with the tour guide energy of someone who had been waiting for a specific audience and was not going to waste the opportunity. This one smelled good. That one was boring. This one had a bug living in it that he had named Gerald. I crouched down to examine Gerald's situation with appropriate interest, while Noah provided context on Gerald's daily routine, which was apparently more structured than mine. He comes out in the morning, Noah explained, and he goes in when it gets cold, like you. I am nothing like Gerald, I said. You both hide when things are too loud. I looked at him. He was examining a leaf with genuine scientific focus and had said this the way he said most things, as simple, observable fact rather than criticism. And I thought about Cael alone in a library while a packed breakfast happened around him and decided not to argue the point. The cold was real. The jacket I had grabbed that morning was not built for standing still in an October garden. And after 20 minutes, my ears had opinions about the situation. I ignored them. Noah was in the middle of explaining the political dynamics between two separate bird families that visited the oak tree, and this felt like important information. The small ones were here first, he said firmly. The big ones just showed up and decided it was theirs. That is a very common pattern, I said. Daddy says the big ones have more right because they are stronger. What do you say? Noah considered this for a moment, looking up at the oak with the serious deliberation of someone who had thought about it before and was checking his answer against his conscience. I say being here first matters, and being here after matters too. He looked at me. Like you. You stayed. That matters. I crouched down to his level, which put us eye to eye, and looked at this child who had not been written, who existed in the spaces the novel had left blank, who understood things about loyalty and presence that most adults spent decades avoiding. Yeah, I said, it does. He smiled at me, bright and uncomplicated, and then looked over my shoulder and his smile changed character slightly, becoming something warmer and more complex. I turned. Everett was crossing the garden toward us, his pack calls apparently concluded, his coat on against the cold, his expression doing the thing Noah had described earlier, the thing where something was his favorite and he had not said so. He was looking at Noah, but he arrived beside me first. We stood next to each other watching Noah resume his investigation of Gerald's situation, and the silence between us was the specific kind that happened when two people had said enough that morning to make ordinary conversation feel insufficient, but had not yet said the thing that was actually waiting. He dragged you out here, Everett said, enthusiastically. He does that. A pause. He did not used to be able to get you out of the library in under an hour. I processed that. Cael had been a library person. Jordan was a library person. The overlap was doing something inconvenient to my sense of separation between myself and the body I was wearing. Maybe I changed my mind about the garden, I said. Everett looked at me sideways. The cold had put color along his cheekbones, and the gray-green of his eyes was very clear in the outdoor light. No window glass to filter it. This close, his scent was the thing it had been in the bedroom that morning. Cedar and cold rain and the warm interior light. And my omega biology registered it with the same embarrassing totality as before. I looked back at the oak tree. Stellan came to find me this morning, I said, before breakfast. The quality of Everett's stillness changed. Not dramatically, a small calibration, the kind that happened in a body when it received information and decided to be very careful about the next thing it said. I know. He warned me about Thursday's session. I assumed he would. I turned to look at him fully then. You assumed, meaning you expected it, meaning you have been watching him do this and have not said anything about it. Everett held my gaze without flinching, which was either honesty or very good control of his response, and I could not yet tell which. Stellan is complicated. Stellan, I said pleasantly, is running a very specific operation inside your house, and has been for long enough that you have gotten comfortable with the word complicated as a way to not look at it directly. The silence that followed was a different texture from the ones before it. Everett said carefully, "What do you know?" "I know about the threat." He went absolutely still. Not the composed stillness that was his default setting. Something different, something underneath the composure. The stillness of a person whose private architecture had just been touched without permission. His voice, when it came, was very quiet and very even, the way things were quiet and even when the alternative was something much louder. He told you about that. He did not tell me anything. I held his gaze. I figured it out. How? One word, flat and direct and carrying the full weight of everything he was not asking alongside it, which was considerably more. I thought about how to answer that. The honest answer was psychometry and a ring, and the particular gift the universe had dropped into this transmigration without explaining itself. And that was not a conversation I was equipped to have in a garden on a Monday morning with a child 4 feet away, explaining bug sociology. I am observant, I said, and Stellan is not as careful as he thinks he is. Everett looked at me for a long moment. Something was shifting behind his eyes, something large and slow that had been in one position for a very long time and was encountering the friction of potential movement. His jaw was set, but his eyes were not, and that incongruence told me more about what he was feeling than anything he had said. "What exactly did you figure out?" he said. "That he has been feeding me information selectively to keep me pointed in a specific direction. That the threat he made against you was real and specific and not the first move he made in whatever this is. And that whatever leverage he thinks he has over you, he also thinks he has over me, which means he has been playing both sides of this for a long time." Everett's hand at his side closed into a loose fist and opened again. Once, controlled and barely visible. "He was my closest friend for 12 years, he said. The weight in that sentence was not small. 12 years. The kind of time that built the specific trust that made betrayal not just painful, but disorienting, because it rewrote everything you remembered about yourself, every good judgment call you thought you had made. "I know," I said, and meant it without performance. Everett looked at me sharply, searching for something in my expression, and whatever he found there, or did not find, seemed to do something to his internal calibration, because he exhaled slowly and turned back toward Noah, and the silence between us changed quality again, becoming something that was not comfortable exactly, but was no longer defensive either. Noah looked up from Gerald's home. "Are you two talking about boring things?" "Yes," I said. "Very boring things," Everett confirmed. Noah accepted this verdict and returned to Gerald. Everett and I stood shoulder to shoulder in the cold garden and did not talk about boring things for approximately 90 seconds, which was long enough for the warmth coming off him to register against my left arm, where our sleeves were almost touching, long enough for me to become very aware of, almost without meaning to, long enough for him to turn his head toward me. At the same moment, I turned mine toward him, and for the resulting proximity to be somewhat more significant than either of us had planned. His eyes dropped to my mouth for exactly 1 second, then back up. My heart did something extremely complicated. His voice came out slightly rougher than usual when he said, "Cael." "I know," I said, which was not a response to anything he had said, but was apparently the correct answer, because something in his expression shifted in a way I felt rather than saw. He leaned in. Not much, half an inch maybe, the kind of movement a person made when they were testing whether a direction was permitted, and I did not move back, which was its own answer, and the cold air between us was becoming something else entirely when Noah said, with perfect 4-year-old timing, "Gerald is gone. He went inside. It is too cold." We both straightened. I looked at the October sky. Everett looked at the oak tree. Neither of us said anything for a full 5 seconds. "Smart bug," I said finally. Everett made a sound that was absolutely a suppressed laugh and turned away to crouch down beside Noah, asking about Gerald's habits with the focused attention of a father who was very deliberately giving himself something else to look at. I pressed the back of my cold hand against my cheek and told my biology to get it together, which was when I heard the footsteps on the garden path behind us. Stellan's voice arrived first, pleasant and completely unhurried. "There you all are. Everett, you have a call. The Harmon territory rep moved the check into now." Everett stood, his composed face back in position. He looked at Stellan, then at me. "I will be back." He moved past Stellan toward the house, and I watched the exchange of proximity between them. The easy way Stellan stepped aside, the way Everett did not register it as anything unusual. And I thought about 12 years and about how long it took to stop seeing something that had learned to look like furniture. Stellan turned to me once Everett was inside. The pleasant face was still there. The citrus scent was still carefully harmless. But something in his eyes had changed quality, just slightly, the way a calculation changed when one of the variables had behaved unexpectedly. "You two seemed comfortable," he said. "It is a comfortable garden," I said. "You were talking for a long time." "We were talking about Gerald." His head tilted. "Who is Gerald?" "A bug," Noah said helpfully, without looking up from the ground where he was apparently checking for Gerald's return. "He went inside because it is cold. He is very smart." Stellan looked at Noah, then back at me, and something moved behind his light eyes that was not pleasant, and was not warm, and did not belong on a face that was performing both of those things. "Walk with me for a moment," he said. It was not a question. I looked at Noah. "Stay on the path, okay?" Noah gave me a thumbs up without looking up. I walked with Stellan to the far edge of the garden, near the oak tree, far enough from Noah for the conversation to be private. The leaves under the tree were deep enough to mute our footsteps. Stellan stopped and turned to face me with his arms loose at his sides, and his voice stripped down to something that was not performing warmth anymore. "What did you tell him?" Stellan said. "Good morning to you too." "Cael." "I told him we spoke this morning," I said. "I told him you mentioned the boundary session. That is all." Stellan looked at me steadily. I looked back with exactly the same energy, which was not the energy he expected from Cael Mercer, because the Cael he had managed for years would have shown something here. Defensiveness, or deflection, or the particular exhaustion of someone carrying a secret too long. I showed him none of those things and watched him recalibrate. "You have been different since you woke up," he said. "People say that. It concerns me." "I appreciate your concern." His voice went very quiet. "Do not play games with me, Cael. You know what I have. You know what I can do with it. Whatever happened while you were unconscious, whatever new angle you think you have found, it will not protect you the way you think it will." He let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. "I have kept you safe in this house. I have kept your name off the worst of what the pack thinks about you. You owe me that consideration." I looked at him for a long moment. He believed every word of that. That was the most interesting part. He had constructed a version of events in which he was Cael's protector, in which the management was care, in which the leverage was kindness. And he had told it to himself so many times, it had become genuine to him. The most dangerous people were not the ones who knew they were doing harm. They were the ones who had written themselves into the story as the necessary friend. "Thank you, Stellan," I said, even, quiet, giving him nothing. His eyes narrowed by a fraction. From the path, Noah called out, "Mama, Gerald is back." I turned away from Stellan and walked back to Noah and crouched down to see Gerald, who had apparently reconsidered the cold and returned to his responsibilities. And I felt Stellan's gaze on my back the entire way. My hands were steady, my mind was not, because in the library flash, in the third memory, Stellan had said, "If you tell Everett what I did," not what Cael did, what Stellan did. And I still did not know the full shape of it. I knew the land dispute, I knew the threat. I knew Noah's biological father was Everett's brother, and that his departure had been 14 months ago. What I did not know was whether that departure had been a choice, or whether Stellan Price had made it for him. "Gerald looks good," I told Noah. "He recovered," Noah said seriously. "He is very strong." "Yeah," I said, "he is." Behind me, Stellan's footsteps moved back toward the house, steady and unhurried, and the October garden went quiet except for the wind through the oak tree and the sound of a 4-year-old telling a bug it was brave for coming back out in the cold. I pressed my sleeved hand flat against my knee and thought, Thursday. I needed to make it to Thursday. And then I needed to burn this whole carefully constructed house of cards down around Stellan Price's expensive shoes before he got to Everett first. The problem with that plan was that I had 2 days to build the match. Noah stayed in the garden another 20 minutes before the cold finally convinced him that Gerald could manage without supervision. Mrs. Calloway appeared at the back door with the timing of someone who had done this before, holding Noah's heavier coat and wearing the expression of a woman who had long since accepted that her job description was primarily keeping small, determined people from freezing to death. "Inside, Mr. Noah," she said. "Hot chocolate." Noah looked at me. "Go," I said. "I will be right behind you." He went because hot chocolate was a compelling argument, and I stood at the edge of the oak tree for another minute alone, letting the cold work its way through my jacket while I thought. What I had, factually, was this: 3 psychometric memories from a ring, one of which showed Stellan threatening Cael with the destruction of everything he had rebuilt inside this house. One showed a hospital room with a man who carried Everett's bone structure and a newborn, and the specific grief of a permanent decision. One showed Stellan in a hallway offering Cael a deal that had not been a deal at all. What I needed was the piece that connected those 3 images into a sequence with a beginning and an end. Because right now they were evidence of behavior without full context, and Everett Kane was not a man who would act on incomplete information. He was careful the way structures were careful, the way load-bearing walls were careful. And if I walked into a room and told him his closest friend of 12 years had been systematically undermining both of them, I needed every stone in that arch to be in place before I started pulling. I needed more from the ring. I pulled my sleeve back, looked at the thin silver band on my right index finger. The metal caught the flat October light and held it without warmth. The last 2 touches had been involuntary, and this would not be. Deliberately reaching into a psychometric object was, as far as I understood it, different from accidental contact. The images might come harder, they might come in pieces, or they might come all at once in a way my borrowed nervous system was not ready for. I pressed my bare thumb firmly against the band. The garden disappeared. What replaced it was not a single memory, but a sequence, rapid and dense, the way a book fell open to multiple pages simultaneously. I caught them in fragments. Stellan and a younger man at a restaurant table, the younger man who had Everett's softened bone structure, leaning forward with something urgent in his posture, while Stellan listened with his hands relaxed and his face arranged in the expression of a person being a very good friend. Then the same man, later, in what looked like a parking garage, his face stripped of urgency and replaced with something emptied out, while Stellan spoke quietly beside him. Then paper. A document with a signature line at the bottom. Then the hospital room again, but this time I saw what I had not seen clearly before. Stellan in the corner, not in the room exactly, but visible through the glass of the door, watching, and his expression through the glass was not the expression of a concerned friend. It was the expression of a person checking whether a plan had worked. I yanked my hand back. The garden came back around me, cold and gold and indifferent. My pulse was doing something irregular, and my hands were shaking for the second time today, and I stood very still under the oak tree and put it together with the systematic focus of someone who had nothing left to do but be accurate. Stellan had not just threatened Cael and leveraged Everett. He had found Noah's biological father, whose name I still did not have, but whose face I now knew with clarity, and he had worked on him. Quietly, patiently, the way you worked on a person who had doubts you could widen into certainty. The man had already been uncertain about his ability to be a father, maybe, or about his place in Everett's life, or about Noah, and Stellan had found that uncertainty and widened it until the man had signed a document and walked away from a newborn child, and the exit had looked like a choice. It had not been a choice. It had been a manufactured one, and Stellan had stood in a hospital doorway and watched it complete. I had 2 days. I walked back into the house. The corridor was warm after the garden, and I stopped in the hallway bathroom to run cold water over my wrists until my hands steadied, which was a technique I had used in my previous life when a piece of fiction got too emotionally real, and I needed to remember I was a person in a body in a physical location. It worked in my previous life. It worked now, which was either a point in favor of the technique or a point against the idea that this situation was as unreal as it felt. I dried my hands, looked at myself in the mirror. Cael Mercer looked back. Sharp jaw, dark eyes, the mouth made for cruelty that I had been giving a different assignment all morning. "Okay," I said quietly to his face. "Here is what we are going to do." What we were going to do was find out the name of Noah's biological father, confirm that Stellan had engineered his departure, and walk into Thursday's boundary session with everything Everett needed to see the full picture without feeling ambushed by the person showing it to him. The last part was the hardest part, because telling Everett the truth meant telling him 2 things at once. One, that his closest friend had been conducting a long and deliberate operation against his pack and his family. 2, that the Omega he had been preparing to exile in Chapter 52 had actually been trying to protect things Stellan had been systematically dismantling. Cael was not the villain of this story. Stellan was, and Cael had known it and had been trying to expose it alone, with no one to believe him, which was why the land grant challenge had looked like a scheme when it was actually an attempt to create a public record of Stellan's interference in pack documentation before Stellan could bury it permanently. I walked back into the main corridor with a direction and a purpose and nearly collided with Everett, who was coming the other way at a pace that said the Harmon call had not gone well. He stopped. I stopped. We were close enough that I registered his scent before I registered his expression, which was counterproductive and something I was apparently just going to have to live with. "The call ended early," he said, reading my question before I asked it. "Good early or bad early?" "Complicated early." He looked at me carefully. "Are you all right? You look like you figured something out." "I look like I figured something out?" "Your face does the thing." I stared at him. "Noah said that this morning." "Noah learned it from me." Something in Everett's expression shifted to something that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same neighborhood. It arrived and departed quickly, but it left a trace. "He watches you." "He watches everything." "Yes, but you specifically." We were standing in a corridor in the middle of a Monday afternoon, having a conversation that had started practical and was developing a texture that was neither practical nor safe for my ability to think clearly, and I was very aware of how close we were standing, and that I had not moved back, and that he had not either. "I need to ask you something," I said. "Ask." "Everett's brother," I said carefully. "Tell me about him." The shift in Everett's expression was immediate and total. Every approaching warmth closed off in a single second, the way a house went dark when every light was switched off simultaneously. His voice came back flat and controlled, and very far from where it had been 30 seconds ago. "Why?" "Because I need to understand what happened." "You know what happened. Tell me what you think I know." His jaw worked. He looked down the corridor, then back at me, and the flatness in his eyes had something underneath it that was raw in the specific way things were raw when they had not been allowed to close properly. "Sawyer left 14 months ago. He decided he was not ready. He signed the documentation and he left, and he has not contacted Noah since." Each sentence was delivered with the careful spacing of a person who had said this exact sequence before, to himself probably, in the dark, enough times that it had become the version of the story that stayed upright when everything else wanted to fall. "Sawyer. Noah's biological father's name was Sawyer Kane." "Did he tell you himself?" I asked. "That he was leaving? Did he say it to you directly?" Everett's eyes came back to mine, sharp now. "What are you saying?" I am asking whether you spoke to him directly or whether the information came to you through someone else. The silence that followed was the longest one of the day. It had a specific quality, the quality of a person standing at the edge of something they had been avoiding looking at directly, feeling the shape of it with their feet before they looked down. Stellan handled the documentation, Everett said, very quiet. Sawyer would not see me. He sent a message through Stellan that he needed space, that he could not do it. I held Everett's gaze and said nothing. I watched him take that sentence apart and look at its components for what might have been the first time. The particular configuration of it. Sawyer would not see me. He sent a message through Stellan. As if hearing it back through a different speaker made the architecture of it suddenly visible in a way it had not been when it was just the version of events he lived inside. Cael, he said. I need you to listen to me, I said, and I need you to hear it as information, not as attack. Can you do that? His chest expanded on a slow breath. Something in him was fighting something else in him, and the fight was visible in a way that almost nothing about Everett Kane was visible. Tell me. Stellan did not deliver Sawyer's message, I said. Stellan wrote it. The corridor went very still. I cannot prove it yet, I said before he could speak, but I will. By Thursday, I will have everything you need to see the full picture. The land documentation, the boundary dispute, what Stellan has been doing in this pack for years. All of it. I just need you to not do anything about him before Thursday. Can you give me that? Everett looked at me for a long time. The winter quality of his eyes was doing something complicated. Not the measuring calculation from this morning. Something that was less controlled and more personal. Something that had been standing behind a very thick door and was pressing on it from the other side with both hands. Why are you doing this? He asked. I thought about that honestly for a moment. Because Noah deserves to know his father, I said, and because you deserve to know your friend. Everett flinched, small and fast and completely real. I did not look away from it. He stood in the corridor with that flinch still working its way through him, and he looked at me with the expression of a man who had been making sense of Cael Mercer for decades and had just been handed a version he did not know how to place, and I waited with my hands loose at my sides and my pulse steady and my borrowed face giving him nothing but honesty. Thursday, he said finally. Thursday. He nodded once, the way he had nodded that morning when I had said I would be at the session. A single movement that meant agreement without performance. Then he turned and walked down the corridor toward the east wing, and I stood where I was and let out a breath that had been waiting since the garden. One day. I had one day to find the rest of it. From the kitchen, Noah's voice rose in triumph over something that sounded like a marshmallow-related victory, and I turned toward the sound of it and walked forward. Because the child was in there, and the child was the reason, and that had not changed and was not going to. Stellan appeared at the far end of the corridor, heading toward the east wing with 2 folders under his arm and the unhurried movement of a man who believed he was still in control of the board. He did not see me watching. I watched anyway. One day, Stellan Price. One day. I spent that day the way I had spent most of my previous life, which was reading. Specifically, I spent it in the library with the door locked and my sleeves rolled up and my right hand working through every object in that room that was old enough to carry weight. Not all psychometry was equal, I had discovered. Recent objects gave recent memories, clear and sharp. Older objects gave older ones, layered and sometimes fragmented, like trying to read a book where several pages had been printed on top of each other. The library had been Cael's territory for long enough that almost everything in it carried something of him. Small impressions, habitual touches, the particular emotional signature of a person who had spent a lot of time thinking very hard in a small space. What I was looking for was documentation. Cael had known what Stellan was doing. The ring memories confirmed that, which meant Cael had been building something, quietly, alone, the way a person built something when they could not trust anyone around them to help carry it. He had been a meticulous person, the kind who kept records not for presentation, but for precision. And he had lived in this library, and if he had hidden evidence anywhere in this house, it was here. I found it in the third shelf from the left, behind a copy of Connecticut Pack Law Amendments from 2019, which was either very clever or exactly the kind of place a person hid something when they wanted it to be invisible through sheer boringness. A folder, thin, brown, unremarkable. Inside it was a printed email chain, 7 pages, between an account I did not recognize and a legal service that specialized in PAC documentation disputes. The emails were clinical and specific. They outlined in the language of legal inquiry a pattern of boundary documentation omissions traceable to a single administrative contact across 3 separate PAC territories over the past 11 years. The administrative contact's name appeared in the 4th email, Stellan Price. There was more. A signed witness statement from someone named R. Calloway, and I thought about Mrs. Calloway and her carefully unreadable expression and the way she had looked at me over Noah's head this morning, and understood that Cael had not been as alone as he had believed. There was a certified copy of the original Mercer-Cain boundary arrangement from 30 years ago, notarized and legitimate, proving the land claim was real. And at the back of the folder, paper clipped together, were 2 pages that made my hands go very still. A copy of Sawyer Cain's parental rights termination document, and beside it, a forensic notation from a document authentication service dated 8 months ago, stating that the signature on the termination document showed significant inconsistency with a verified sample of Sawyer Cain's handwriting and recommended further investigation. Cael had known. He had found the forgery 8 months ago. He had been sitting on proof that Sawyer had not willingly signed away his son, and he had not been able to use it because Stellan had the threat, the first petition, the thing that would make Everett's trust collapse before Cael could finish building the case. He had been trapped. I sat back in the armchair and looked at the folder in my hands, and felt something that was grief and anger in equal measure. Grief for a fictional man who had been failed at every turn, and written as the villain of his own story. Anger at the neat and patient cruelty of someone who had made himself indispensable to everyone around him while he quietly took everything apart. Then I picked up the folder and went to find Everett. He was in his office at the end of the east wing, the door partially open, and I knocked twice and pushed it open without waiting, because I had approximately 18 hours until Thursday morning, and waiting was not a luxury I had. He looked up from his desk. I put the folder in front of him and sat down in the chair across from him and said, "Read the last 2 pages first." He looked at me for a moment, then he opened the folder and read. I watched his face. The control held for the first page. The second page was where it started to go, something tightening around his eyes, something working at the corner of his jaw that he was not fully managing to still. He read it twice. I knew he read it twice because his eyes went back to the top of the page after he reached the bottom. The way a person reread something that had rearranged the furniture in a room they had been living in for over a year. When he looked up, his voice was very even and very careful, the way voices were careful when the alternative was not careful at all. "Where did you get this?" "The library, 3rd shelf, behind the Pack Law Amendments." Something moved through his expression that was not about me. He was remembering something, a moment or a conversation, something that was assembling itself differently now that the context had changed. "He hid it," Everett said. "He was protecting it," I said, "until he could use it safely." Everett looked back at the folder. He turned to the email chain and read that too, slowly, each page receiving the careful attention of a man who was not going to act on something he had not read completely. I waited. The office was quiet. Somewhere in the house I could hear Noah and Mrs. Calloway, distant and warm, and outside the window the afternoon had gone the deep blue-gray of an October day that was considering becoming evening. When Everett finished, he set the folder on his desk with the precise care of someone setting down something fragile, even though it was just paper, and he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. 11 years, he said, at least. The Morrison territory dispute, the Harmon boundary issue. He said each one with the flat recognition of someone pulling threads and watching a larger pattern emerge. Every time there was a documentation gap in the region, Stellan was the one who found it. He was the one who recommended the administrative review. I trusted his judgment because he found the problems. He stopped. He was creating the problems. And billing the solutions, I said. Everett brought his eyes back to me. Sawyer did not sign this. No. Stellan forged my brother's signature on a document that took his son from him. Yes. The word landed in the room like a stone in still water, and the silence that followed it was not empty. It was full of the specific weight of a man rearranging 14 months of grief and anger and bewilderment into a new configuration that was worse in some ways and better in one enormous one. Sawyer had not left by choice. Sawyer had been moved, which meant Sawyer could come back. Everett stood up. I need to make a call, he said. I know. And then I need to handle Stellan before Thursday. Everett, I stood too. He looked at me. Handle it cleanly. He needs to not be able to say it was personal. Something in his expression acknowledged that. The recognition of a man who understood that the difference between justice and destruction was documentation and witnesses and the absence of visible fury, even when the fury was entirely earned. He nodded once. Keep Noah occupied, he said. Already my primary occupation. He crossed to the door, then stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back. He looked at me for a moment with an expression I had been trying to name all day, something that did not fit neatly into any category I had, and then he said, quietly and without performance, Why did you stay, Cael? Originally, when Noah was born, you did not have to. I thought about the boy in the photograph, 12 years old and laughing with his whole face. I thought about a man in a hospital room holding a newborn with gutted certainty. I thought about Cael Mercer, who the novel had written as a villain because it had never bothered to look at him from the inside. Because somebody had to, I said. Everett held my gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he turned and walked down the hall, and I heard him reach for his phone before he had made it to the staircase. I went to find Noah. He was in the kitchen with Mrs. Calloway, who was teaching him to measure flour with an accuracy that was perhaps ambitious for a 4-year-old, but that Noah was approaching with the seriousness of a professional. He had flour on his left cheek and biscuit propped against the mixing bowl as an observer. Mama, he said, without looking up from the measuring cup, we are making cookies. I can see that. You can help, but you have to wash your hands first. Those are reasonable terms. I washed my hands. I stood at the counter beside Noah and followed Mrs. Calloway's instructions, which were given with the calm authority of someone who had run this kitchen through considerable chaos and was not going to let cookie production be the thing that broke her. Noah narrated every step to Biscuit. The kitchen was warm and smelled of vanilla and flour and the cedar-warm sweetness of a small person who was completely, serenely content. I let myself be in it. Just for an hour, I let myself be in a kitchen in Connecticut, making cookies with a child who called me Mama, and a housekeeper who handed me a wooden spoon without being asked. And I did not think about rings or forgeries or Thursday or the novel I had died reading, and I thought, very quietly, in the part of me that was still learning what this life was, that this was the thing Cael had been fighting for. Not the land, not the pack politics, exactly this. Everett came back as the first batch came out of the oven. He stood in the kitchen doorway and Noah looked up and said, Daddy, we made snickerdoodles. And Everett came into the kitchen and crouched down and looked at his son with the weather turning to summer expression. And then he looked at me over Noah's head and said, quietly, It is handled. I looked back at him. Sawyer? I reached him. A pause. Something moved through his expression that was too large for the kitchen and too private to name fully. He has been trying to contact Noah for 4 months. His messages were not getting through. Of course they had not been getting through. I looked at the snickerdoodles cooling on the rack and thought about what it cost a person to find out that the silence they had been grieving was not silence at all. That someone on the other end had been trying to reach them for months and had been intercepted by a man with a pleasant face and a calibrated smile who had decided their family was a resource to be managed. Noah, Everett said, his voice finding the particular steadiness of a father who was holding something enormous and keeping it out of his face for his child's sake. I have someone who wants to say hello to you on the phone, someone who loves you very much and has been missing you. Noah looked up with his flour-dusted cheek in his enormous brown eyes. Who? Everett held out his phone. Noah took it, looked at the screen, and then made a sound that I was not prepared for. A small, high, completely unguarded sound of recognition and joy, and said, Papa, in the voice of a child who had been waiting for something without knowing how to name it. I turned toward the oven because I needed somewhere to look that was not that. Mrs. Calloway placed a snickerdoodle in my hand without comment. I ate it. It was excellent. I focused on how excellent it was with the determination of someone who was absolutely not going to cry in a kitchen in Connecticut on a Monday evening because a 4-year-old just said, Papa, into a phone. I was not going to do that. I did it anyway, just slightly, just enough that I had to press the back of my flour-dusted hand against my eye once, quickly, while Noah carried the phone into the hallway to tell his papa about Gerald and Biscuit and the snickerdoodles with the rushing, tumbling urgency of a child who had too much to say and had been waiting too long to say it. Everett appeared beside me at the counter. I did not look at him. You are crying, he said. I am not crying. I have something in my eye. Both eyes? It is a very ambitious piece of dust. I pressed my hand against my face again and got myself together with the focused effort of someone who had woken up as a villain this morning and was not going to end the day falling apart in front of the hero. I lowered my hand, looked at the cooling rack. He is going to want to come back. I know, Everett said. I want him to. That is going to be complicated. Most things worth having are. I looked at him sideways. He was watching the hallway where Noah's voice was still going, animated and continuous, and full of a happiness that had been missing something and had just found it. Everett's face was doing several things at once, and he was not trying to manage any of them, which was new, which was the most new thing about this entire, very new day. What happens to Stellan? I asked. Packed tribunal. Thursday is still happening, but the agenda has changed. He paused. The documentation you found constitutes enough for a formal challenge. He will not be sitting at that table by the end of the week. And the Mercer land? Everett turned to look at me fully. The kitchen light was doing something warm to the gray-green of his eyes that the morning light had not done. And he was standing close enough that his scent was present in the way it had been in the bedroom and the garden. That cedar and cold rain and interior warmth that my biology had apparently decided to have a consistent and detailed opinion about. I am having the boundary revision filed this week, he said, with full documentation. The land is recognized as Mercer territory. It should have been filed 30 years ago. Something loosened in my chest that I had not fully known was tight. Not because of the land itself. I did not own land. I was a person from New Haven who had died reading a novel and woken up in someone else's life. But because Cael had wanted that recognition for reasons that were legitimate and human and had nothing to do with malice. And he had spent years being called a villain for wanting it. And the recognition felt like something owed to him wherever he was, whatever it meant that I was here instead. Thank you, I said. Do not thank me. It is a correction, not a favor. He said it simply, without deflection. Then quieter, I owe you more than a boundary filing, Cael. You do not owe me anything. I spent 2 years believing you were trying to destroy me. I was not making it easy to believe anything else. You were protecting Noah. You were building a case that you could not present because I had already decided what I thought of you, and you did it anyway. His voice was very low now, just for the kitchen, just for the space between us. That is not nothing. That is the opposite of nothing. I looked at the snickerdoodle in my hand and thought about the novel that had never written any of this. The author had seen Cael from the outside and seen malice. From the inside, there was only a person who had run out of legitimate options and had still somehow chosen to stay, had still chosen the child, had still chosen the slow, frustrating, invisible work of trying to protect something rather than simply burning it down. That was not the arc of a villain. That was the arc of someone who loves something more than they love being right. Everett, I said. Yes. I need to tell you something, and I need you to not react immediately. I need you to just hear it. He went still. Not the defensive stillness from before, the listening kind. All right. I turned to face him fully. I had spent all day working around the edges of this, managing it, keeping it in its box, and the box was not going to hold anymore. I am not exactly who you think I am. His eyes searched my face. I know that. I mean that more literally than you think I mean it. Cael. I woke up 4 days ago and I did not have any of his memories, I said. I knew the story from the outside. I knew the house and the characters and the politics because I had read about them. But I did not wake up as him. I woke up as someone who had read about him and then had to become him quickly enough that no one noticed the difference. The kitchen was very quiet. Noah's voice drifted in from the hallway, still going, telling his papa about Gerald with detailed enthusiasm. Everett looked at me for a long time. Long enough that I started to construct contingency plans for various categories of response, ranging from disbelief to alarm to the kind of quiet, controlled anger that was his default response to things that threatened his sense of order. What I did not construct a contingency plan for was what actually happened. He reached out and took the snickerdoodle from my hand, set it on the counter, and then took my hand in both of his, carefully, the way you held something you were deciding whether to keep. The scent change, he said. Yes. The way you ask questions you already should have known the answers to. Yes. The way you looked at Noah like you were meeting him for the first time. Yes. He looked down at my hand in his. His thumb moved once across my knuckles, slow and deliberate, and the warmth of it went all the way up my arm and did several things to my ability to think in complete sentences. Are you real? He asked, not skeptically, with the particular seriousness of a man asking a question that mattered more than it was supposed to. I thought about it honestly for a moment. I think so, I said. This feels real. You feel real. Noah is definitely real. The cookies are objectively real. I paused. I am not Cael, but I am here, and I am not leaving. He looked up from my hand to my face. Why not? He asked. You could have. You woke up in a situation that was not yours, and you had every reason to keep your distance and manage it from a safe angle. Why did you not? I thought about a boy in a photograph at 12, laughing with everything he had. I thought about Gerald the bug coming back out into the cold because that was where his responsibilities were. I thought about Noah's small hands covering my trembling ones in a library armchair and his voice saying with absolute certainty, I am here. Because being here first matters, I said, and being here after matters too. Something broke open in Everett's expression then, quietly and completely, the way a tide broke against something that had been standing against it for a very long time. He did not say anything. He took one step forward and brought his free hand up to the side of my face and held it there, his thumb at my cheekbone, and looked at me the way Noah had said he looked at the garden, like it was his favorite thing, like he had forgotten to say so. I leaned into it before I had decided to. He kissed me. Not the almost from the garden, not the half-inch of testing direction. This was deliberate and warm and tasted faintly of snickerdoodle because he had stolen a piece earlier when I had not been watching. And I would have laughed at that, except that laughing required distance, and I did not want distance. So I stayed where I was with his hand warm against my face and gave him back everything he was giving me and let the kitchen be warm around us and let it be enough. It was more than enough. It was the most real thing I had felt since I died on a Tuesday. He pulled back just far enough to rest his forehead against mine, both of us breathing, and his eyes were closed and his hand was still at my face, and the kitchen smelled of vanilla and October and cedar and cold rain. "Still cataloging?" he asked, very quiet. "Constantly," I said. "It is a medical condition." He made the sound that was almost a laugh. Then it became an actual laugh, low and real, and the kind of sound that changed the shape of a room by being in it. And I felt it against my cheek and in my chest, and in the specific, undefended place that Noah had been cracking open gently all day. Noah's footsteps came back down the hall. We separated with approximately 1 second to spare. Noah appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding Everett's phone with both hands and an expression of tremendous import. "Papa says he is coming," he announced. "He is coming next week. He wants to see me, and he says he is sorry, and he cried a little bit." Noah considered this. "I told him it was okay to cry. Mama says crying means something mattered." Everett and I both looked at Noah. "Did I say that?" I asked. "This morning, when Gerald went inside. You looked like you might cry, and I asked why, and you said that." I had no memory of saying that. It was entirely possible I had said it, the way you said things when a 4-year-old asked you a direct question, and you answered honestly without thinking about whether it was the kind of thing that got remembered. "Smart mama," Noah said, with the decisive satisfaction of someone closing an argument, and came to stand between us at the counter and reached for a snickerdoodle with the confidence of someone who had made them and was therefore entitled. Mrs. Calloway appeared in the doorway, assessed the situation in the kitchen with one comprehensive look, and said, "Dinner in 45 minutes, with the equanimity of a woman who had seen everything and was not surprised by any of it. "Mrs. Calloway," I said. She looked at me over her glasses. "Thank you," I said, "for the witness statement. That was in the folder." She held my gaze for a moment, then she said simply, "He was a good man who made difficult choices for good reasons. Someone ought to have said so a long time ago." She turned back to the hallway. 45 minutes. She was gone. Noah ate his snickerdoodle. Everett poured himself a glass of water and stood at the counter with the easy stillness of someone who had put something down that he had been carrying for a very long time and was feeling the difference in his shoulders. Outside the kitchen window, the October evening had gone fully dark, the garden invisible beyond the glass, and the kitchen held its warmth like a house that had remembered what it was for. I picked up my snickerdoodle. Noah leaned against my arm with the automatic comfort of habit and said, to no one in particular, "This is the best Monday." Everett met my eyes over his head. I thought about chapter 52, about exile and winter, and the ending the novel had written for this body and this life. About a story that had been told from the outside by someone who had never once thought to ask what it looked like from in here. I thought about Gerald, who went inside when it was cold and came back out when it was time. "Yeah," I said, "to Noah, to the kitchen, to the warm and specific and improbable life I had woken up inside without asking. It really is." Everett's hand found mine on the counter, easy and unhurried, and held it. Outside, the October dark pressed against the kitchen window. Inside, everything was warm.